How about that? That's better. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Michael Brown, president of SAR. It's great to see a terrific crowd here. Just for our own purposes, how many of you are members of SAR? Well, that's pretty impressive. I hope those of you who are not members feel terrible and you're inspired to join us. We've got a top flight development and membership staff back there waiting to receive your membership applications. The acceptance rate is very high, so not like applying to college or anything like that. This is, we're starting off the individual presentations by resident scholars with a real rock star. But before I introduce Patty Crown, let me mention a couple things on the horizon. Again, might be interesting to those of you who are not members, or as we say, not yet members. And members first, the first public lecture of this season is scheduled for October 16th. That's a Wednesday. We normally do them on Thursdays, but this is a special occasion. And the lecture will be given at the Convention Center downtown because we're doing it in association with another organization that's running a conference on the future of work and retraining people for future jobs. That's the theme for this year's series. So the speaker is Thomas Malone from MIT, and the title of his talk is Superminds: The Surprising Power of People and Computers Thinking Together. So the salon, which follows that, is the next day. So it'll be on Thursday morning at 10 rather than the usual Friday morning. Do we have spaces left in the salon? How are we doing? We do? Okay. And those of you who haven't been here before know that for the last year, as part of the Creative Thought Forum, we not only have the public lectures given, but we do a small seminar type thing, usually limited to 25 to 30 people. That's strictly a Q&A with the speaker. So he or she might take 10 minutes to brief people on things, and then it's just an open-ended discussion. So it's kind of like the best college seminar you probably cut when you were 18 years old. As I certainly did. The second thing I wanted to remind you of is that we have the Southwest premiere of Doug Preston's documentary, The Lost City of the Monkey God. That's scheduled for the 23rd at Violet Crown. That's a fundraiser for us, so the ticket prices are slightly higher than you may be accustomed to. But Doug Preston will be there. As you know, this was a bestseller. He'll be coming with Bill Benenson and Steve Elkins, who produced the film. Then on the salon the next day, we'll have participation by the Honduran colleagues, I think via Skype, though that's not all fully settled yet. And you know, there was some controversy associated with the work, and we'll be talking about that and about the production of the film. And those of you who know Doug Preston know that he's just a fantastic speaker and a great guy, a former board member of SAR and currently an advisory board member of SAR. And I think he's also the president of the Authors Guild nationally. So he's a very influential person and a resident of Santa Fe. In New Mexico, Patty Crown needs no introduction, but it's my job to introduce her anyway. She's arguably the most prominent, or certainly one of the most prominent archaeologists in the Southwest. She's the Leslie Spier Distinguished Professor of Anthropology at UNM. She's the author or editor of 6 books, and by my account, author or co-author of more than 40 book chapters and journal articles just since 2000, which raises the question of whether this woman ever sleeps. But we don't really care because we benefit from her insights. She also most recently won the Alfred V. Kidder Award for Eminence in the Field of Archaeology. Please join me in welcoming Patricia Crown.
Is this good? Okay. Thank you, Michael, for all those lies. So today I'm going to be talking about my fellowship project here this year, since I'm one of the resident fellows. And it's a project that is the culmination of 2 decades of research. Before I get started, I need to put in a disclaimer, and that is that none of the photographs, or none of the vessels in the photographs that you'll be seeing today come from burials. So there is nothing from a burial in this presentation. Okay, so my research examined cylinder jars from Chaco Canyon. It's a relatively rare form of pottery, largely found only in Chaco, and I'll be talking more about that in a few minutes. My larger interest is in social drinking, which provides an opportunity for elaboration that often leads to hierarchy in societies. Anthropologists have been concerned primarily with alcohol consumption. So when you look at the literature on drinking that's done by anthropologists, it's mostly about drinking alcohol. So it has been rather hard to find anthropological discussions of drinking that are not about alcohol. And what they were drinking in Chaco was definitely not alcohol. It was probably mostly chocolate and maybe some holly drinks, but we'll get to that in a few minutes. So I'm going to start by talking about theoretical literature, theoretical ideas about drinking worldwide that are based mostly on cross-cultural research, on ethnographic research in the Southwest, and on what we know from the archaeological record in other places. We know that societies vary in the ingredients and recipes for their drinks, the paraphernalia that they use for drinking, the context of drinking, the practices associated with drink consumption, the amount that people consume on a single occasion, who can drink and how often, how widely drinking occurs, and the social response to drinking. So I'm going to begin by going through theory as far as I've been able to get at this point. And as I said, it's mostly cross-cultural, ethnographic, and archaeological, some historical. All right, so worldwide, the earliest drinking vessels are made of natural materials, gourds, calabashes, eggs, coconuts, shells, horns, wood, bones, skins, or shell. This is then followed by replacement, usually with ceramics, thank you for laughing, usually with ceramics that mimic the forms. And so on the upper left, you see a drinking horn that is ceramic, and you can't really see in the slide, but it has a very elaborate etched design on it. Then to the left, there's a gold and iron drinking horn. Below that is an Italian glass drinking horn, and then to the right is the BPA-free, dishwasher-safe drinking form. These are called skeuomorphs, which is just a term that means that somebody takes the form of something and copies it in a completely different material. So the form remains the same, but the material and sometimes the decoration change. And often worldwide with drinking, the first drinking vessels that are not natural materials are skeuomorphs of those natural materials. So they might be horns. In the Southwest, they tend to be gourds, but gourd-shaped, but made out of ceramics. Other parts of the world, we see the same thing, that there's this shift in materials. So it's a skeuomorph, looks the same, different materials. A reason to do that is that people can retain the same customs for using the form, because the basic form remains the same. But now they are able to elaborate that form by putting decorations on it, making it out of metal, adding gold, making it BPA-free. All of these things that distinguish the drinker. So they are now drinking out of something that has the same basic form, but is more special than what everybody else is using. Now, sometimes drinks in societies are served in vessels that are large enough for an entire group to consume out of them. And often they use, as you see here, they use long straws to make that possible. Such communal drinking practices are very much associated with egalitarian ideals and solidarity. So they occur in societies that want to present themselves as being egalitarian. Everybody drinks out of the same pot, everybody gets the same drink out of it, everybody can drink as much as they want out of it. It makes everybody equal. In a shift to individual containers from those group containers permits more personal elaboration in the size of the vessel, in the decoration on the vessel, and in the materials used for the vessel. Size of the vessel often relates to the age and status of the drinker. Customs tend to change with individual vessels as well, especially when there are vessels that can be held in one hand, because the vessel then becomes associated with the drinker. They are placed in front of the drinker, and then the drinker holds and drinks out of them. And this is a big shift from those sort of communal drinking events. So drinking from individual vessels tends to be associated with hierarchy and often with tensions within a community. Also, individual vessels require pouring. So there's more focus on performance. The act of pouring the drink, often the act of preparing the drink, becomes a sort of theatrical performance, as you can, you think about when you're at a very fancy restaurant and somebody brings the wine out. In these societies, women often prepare and serve the drinks in a public setting, and then men consume the drink. As the number of distinct drinks increases, the number of distinct vessel forms increase as well, along with other paraphernalia and etiquette and ritualized behavior associated with drinking. Here we see a Victorian place setting, which included up to 10 different shapes of stemware. And that does not count the cups for coffee and tea. So within sedentary societies, drink-specific vessel forms and the number of forms and the number of drinks that go with them become important means of social differentiation and hierarchy. The more elaborate the social hierarchy, the more elaborate the drinking vessel assemblage, and the greater the use of decoration and precious materials to differentiate forms as well as individuals. For archaeologists, this means that different forms of vessels may signal different drinks, different regions, different social classes, and different etiquette. Changes in vessel forms may indicate change in religious practices, in trade contacts, in beverages, in etiquette, or in elite status markers. Very rapid change in vessel forms often signal new socio-political institutions and ideologies. They may also signal conquest. A corollary is that drinking practice always impacts craft production and exchange. Authentic or emulated foreign drinking vessels may differentiate elite drinking even when the drink itself is scarce. And what I'm saying there is that even when you can't get the drink, you may use the vessel form to imply that you have the drink. So this Coke can could have water in it for all we know. So even when the drink is scarce, the vessel comes to represent the drink and symbolize that drink regardless of whether it was available or not. And it becomes useful to think about transparent versus opaque vessels. With opaque vessels, including ceramics, you cannot actually see what's inside them. It could be water, But if the vessel has come to be associated with something special like chocolate, you might hold it up in a public performance and have people think you're drinking chocolate when in fact that isn't what you're drinking. There also is no way to actually tell how much is inside such a vessel when they're opaque. So glass vessels sort of change the game because people can see what's inside them and they can see how much you're actually drinking. When drink is scarce, control of drinking tends to be very high in societies. And this usually means that men limit women's consumption. And there may also be sumptuary laws or taboos that keep certain groups of people from being able to drink. Most societies have drinks that are associated with religious rituals and different drinks that are associated with secular rituals. Medicinal drinks are very common as well. Events that are associated with drinking worldwide include work parties and rites of passage, such as this marriage group on the right. Thanksgiving offerings, dedications to gods or ancestors, elections of leaders, and prestige feasting are often very common settings for drinking as well. Outside of religious ritual or medicine, most ritual drinking is collective and associated with mobilizing labor for community works. So drinking vessels are common in attracting labor. You serve drinks, people come, and then they're obligated to work for you. Drinking vessels are also common worldwide as funerary objects. Hosting drinking events depends on the ability of the host to produce the beverages and obtain their ingredients. And drinking events create social debt and alliances. They're also an outlet for competition in societies. Drinking rituals typically involve highly standardized behaviors, including who sits where the vessels are placed, ways of holding the vessels, and the order in which you drink. Some individuals in a society hold this knowledge about etiquette and manners, and others may not. And this creates a hierarchy based on knowledge, so that some people don't know what they're supposed to do at drinking events, while other people do know. Etiquette also means, or provides a means to challenge power structures. The adoption of new forms of drink may weaken existing power structures and escalate social competition. Adopting a foreign drinking custom can differentiate groups and create a symbolic link with the emulated group, whether one actually exists or not. A decline in factional competition may lead to a decline in feasting, and drink may be associated with elites and exclusivity instead. Colonization often involved engaging the colonized with drink, then later forbidding access to the drink. With individual vessels, shared and identical forms represent a common tradition. So if everybody has the same basic form, it shows that they're participating and believe in this common tradition. But then differences in the form, in the color, and designs can reflect identity negotiation. So these are vessels used by the Inca. The gold cup on the right was reserved for the ruler. Silver, which I couldn't find a picture of, for high status individuals. Painted ceramic and wood could elevate the status of the drinker depending on the craftsmanship of the vessel, and then very plain wooden drinking vessels were for commoners. These drinking vessels were used on ceremonial occasions, and this will be important later. The Inca ruler had a pair of identical vessels, and he used them to toast the sun. So he drank from one, and the other was given to the sun for drinking. They were also used to cement alliances, often by the ruler giving the drinking vessel to other individuals to create an alliance. When segments of population use distinctive vessel forms, so when you've got different groups within the same society using completely different drinking forms, it usually means that there's competition and factionalism. And so most of the events are more about attracting leaders and getting alliances than they are necessarily about the ritual activities involved. So drink is very much associated with politics. It's associated with the development of hierarchies, with the creation of alliances, and with interaction and negotiation. So switching to the Southwest, there isn't a lot of ethnographic information on drinking in the Southwest, but there is variation across different groups in the Southwest, or pre-Hispanic groups in the Southwest. And that includes, drinking includes both secular and social occasions, as well as religious rituals. The purpose is to bring rain, to engage kinship relations, for purification, curing, and various rites of passage. Common containers used include gourd dippers, shells, and ceramic medicine bowls. Nothing modern, nothing metal. Some drinks are associated with specific religious groups or sodalities, and they're consumed in private ceremonial locations. Others are consumed in more public locations. The recipes vary, but they include ingredients obtained from a distance and sometimes fermented. Some rituals include a leader and some ranking of who drinks, when they drink, and out of what vessel. Okay, so let's switch to Chaco Canyon. This is the sequence of drinking vessel history in Chaco. It starts at about AD 500 when we see the earliest ceramics, and goes up until about AD 1200 when the canyon is largely depopulated. The earliest vessel forms were probably gourds. Like other parts of the world, we start with the natural form, so gourds were probably the earliest drinking vessels. That was followed by 500 by what is called a tecomate, or seed jar, or necklace jar. These are probably based on gourds, so they're probably a skeuomorph or copy of a gourd shape. And they probably maintain the same drinking conventions as you would find with gourds, while providing a new form that allowed for more decoration and more differentiation. This was followed by, at about AD 650, by the Gourd Effigy Jar. These are vessels that look just like gourds, but are used for drinking. There aren't a lot of them in Chaco, but it's a very distinctive form. And then we have the pitcher that appears at about AD 700 and remains until 1100. It has varied designs, and the shapes change over time. So the form on the left is the earliest, and the form on the right is the latest. And so we're seeing this slowly evolving change in the pitcher form, but basically they're all pitchers, except without a downspout of any kind. Some were made in imported redware as well, providing yet another opportunity for differentiation in group settings. The earliest cylinder jar-like vessel appears around AD 700. They're small, they're more the size of, I don't know, like a whiskey glass or a small tumbler. They're smaller than most cylinder jars. This one comes from the area around Durango. And I only know of 2 of these vessels, so they're very rare and may have just been an experiment that possibly failed. But the vessels that we most recognize as cylinder jars appear at about AD 875, somewhere between 875 and 1050, when a type called red Mesa black on white is being produced. There are only 3 cylinder jars of this particular type known in any southwestern museums. They're all extremely large vessels. The volume of them is much larger than most regular cylinder vessels. And so I suspect that, and none of them has provenience. They are all at institutions that Edgar Lee Hewitt founded, which seems a little suspicious somehow. One is at the Museum of Man, the Museum of New Mexico, and one of them here. And yet none of them has provenience, so we don't really know exactly where they came from. It may have been Chaco Canyon. We just don't know for sure. So they're very large. They would require 2 hands to hold up, and they may have been used for group drinking. So a group might have used straws around them. They might have been passed around. This one in particular, I love the base of it because it has this unscraped coil on the bottom. So if it was held tipped up while drinking, you would see that wonderful spiral on the bottom that hopefully all of you can see in this slide. Over the next 1 to 200 years, depending on when those ones date to, the average size of the cylinder jar declined. So on the left, we have the very large Red Mesa black on white cylinder jars, and then by 1100, they are about, the average is about 9 to 10 centimeters, which is getting to a size that you can hold in a single hand rather than one that requires 2 hands to hold. And this is what some of them look like. This is some of the latest cylinder jar forms. And you can see that they're much more graceful vessels, clearly intended for individual drinking and probably associated more with the identity of the drinker than that large bucket-shaped form would be. Now, one of the interesting things about Chaco and cylinder jars is that they, starting at about AD 1050, they were produced in sets. So much like we see with the Incan example, there were sets of vessels, sets of identical vessels, and 2 to 4 of them were produced. So here we have a pair of vessels, clearly made by the same potter, clearly the same design. One is at the Smithsonian and one is at the American Museum of Natural History in New York. So I swear they're not the same vessel. These are 2 very different vessels. But this production of sets of vessels tells us a few things. One is that, again, crafts production has been impacted by drinking practice. So something has happened with drinking practice that you now had to have 2 to 4 identical vessels as part of the drinking activity. And that would impact potters who normally do not produce identical vessels. I know there's some potters in the audience, and potters usually like to be creative, and they don't produce exactly the same vessels. So in the Southwest, we normally don't see 2 vessels that are exactly the same. But in the cylinder jars, there are these sets, and they occur over and over again. Having sets really does imply that there's there's performance involved in their use, there's etiquette, and that it's fairly rigid. So there's one set. Here's another set. They don't have identical designs, but you can tell it's the same potter who had a kind of a lean. Here are 4, they're called whiteware because you don't see any designs on it, but all 4 of these actually have a maker's mark on the bottom, so a black painted circle on the base of them. So they were painted. And my research has suggested that these, what we call the white vessels, in fact had a plaster coating and then brightly painted designs put on them that then could be eliminated, could be washed off, and a new design placed on for the next ceremony. So they were being cleansed and renewed. Excuse me, have a little drink here. Cleansed and renewed over time, much in the same way that Kiva murals were, that they would be either cleansed or whitewashed over the designs and then new designs put on. There was a lot of variation in the size and the volume of the vessels. The one on the left here, the venti, is huge. It's really an enormous vessel and almost twice the size of the little guy to the right, the tall. So a lot of variation in the size and the volume. There was variation in the quality of the technology. The one on the left is just absolutely beautifully made, and you can see it has a maker's mark on the bottom, the white stripe. The one on the right is one of the worst vessels I've ever encountered in my life. It's the rim it just sort of peters out to almost nothing. They didn't finish the rim, in other words. They just sort of, I don't know, ran out of energy. It's really just a horrible vessel. There's a lot of variation in the designs, although many of them do have the hatch designs that you see here. But there's variation in the quality of the designs. The one on the left, you can see that it's not the best effort. And the one on the right was never finished. They outlined the design and then decided that hatching was too tiring and so something else happened and they had to leave and they fired it anyway. This shows more variation in the quality. On the right, a beautifully made and decorated vessel, and on the left, it's about the size of a shot glass. It's only about this tall, and it has a design that almost certainly was made by a child. It's so clumsily done. Somebody who was just learning how to hatch, and so you can see that it's a charming attempt. But for an anthropologist, what it tells us is that it didn't take a specialist to make these vessels. There may have been specialists involved in making some of them, but children also were allowed to make cylinder vessels. This is one of only 2 double cylinder jars known in the Southwest. The other occurred in a burial and has not been photographed. It was found outside of Chaco Canyon. But this one occurred within Pueblo Bonito, and it is quite a spectacular but very odd vessel. In order to make it work, they had to add a lot of armature. So the base is enormous and sort of shaped like a figure 8, and then they have this sort of buttressing to connect the 2 vessels together. And this vessel will appear again later, so remember it. Now, not all of them were made in Chaco. In fact, we don't really know how many were made in Chaco because the clays that appear in Chaco occur outside of Chaco as well. So it's very hard to pinpoint what was made in Chaco and what wasn't. But some of them clearly were brought in from the outside. The one on the left is a type called Cholo Red, which probably occurs in the petrified forest and to the south in Arizona. The one in the middle that is one of the all-white ones comes from the Chusca, just east of the Chusca Mountains. And then the one on the right is a Cibola whiteware, and either came from the Chaco or someplace close by. These are the Cholo Red cylinder jars. There are 4 of them. They are absolutely identical in size. They're beautifully made. Okay, so what were they drinking out of these? Well, the residue analysis that I've done suggests that there were at least 2, maybe 2 different drinks being consumed. One of them was the aroma cacao or chocolate on the left. Comes from the tropics of Mesoamerica, would not grow in Chaco Canyon, definitely. So it is definitely a traded food item. And then on the right we have Ilex. It's called Ilex vomitoria because when Europeans first arrived, it was made into a tea in the southeastern part of the US, particularly and all along the Gulf Coast where it grows. It has incredibly high amounts of caffeine, and people would make it into a brewed tea and then drink it and then vomit. But the vomiting was not apparently caused by the drink. It was part of a kind of purification ritual. But the people who saw this assumed it was caused by the holly, and so they named the holly Ilex vomitoria. It's a really unfortunate name. Nobody wants to be associated with it. People are happy to say we drank chocolate, but nobody wants to say we drank Ilex vomitoria. Okay, so in terms of how it was being prepared, and this kind of theatrical part of it, I think that the fact that the vessels were made in sets of 2 to 4 indicates that they were frothing the drink by a technique that involves pouring from one vessel that is held up high in a cascading waterfall down into a vessel below. Froth throughout Mesoamerica was considered to be the most delicious part of the drink. And so frothing almost certainly was an important part of drink preparation in Chaco as well. And having 2 vessels suggests the possibility that they were frothing from one vessel to the other, and frothing using the technique that was used by both the Maya and the Aztecs, which was the one I described, holding one vessel up and pouring down into the one below to create this bubbly froth. Heat retention studies show that cylinder jars have superior heat retention. I made my research assistant do this. I gave her 3 vessels with identical volumes, and we poured boiling water in them, and then she had to take the temperature every minute and watch until they got down to room temperature. And you can see that the cylinder jar has the really superior heat retention. When I told my son, who majored in physics, about this, he said, "Well, I could have told you that." Okay, why didn't you? So that suggests the possibility that they were serving the drinks hot. The other sort of bit of information that suggests a hot drink is that sandstone discs, just the size of the openings for the cylinder jars, are generally found in the same rooms with the cylinder jars. And many people have suggested their jar lids to keep the heat in, as you see here. I think it's just as likely they were coasters to keep rings off the furniture. As you see on the right, you just never really know. But if they are jar lids, which honestly they probably are, that again would suggest that they were trying to keep heat in the vessel and suggest that the drink was hot. So where did the idea for cylinder jars come from to Chaco Canyon? Cylinder jars do occur throughout Mesoamerica, and there they were used for drinking cacao. Cylinder jars appear in Mesoamerica at about AD 550, and then they spread. This is a slide that was put together by a Mayanist for me. Those of you who know Dori Reinsbudet, this is her work. And it shows the distribution from Chiapas to northern Honduras of cylinder jar forms. And they last up until the late Classic period, up until about 900, 950. Now in the Maya area, divinely sanctioned kings held feasts, and they would gift a cylinder jar and cacao nibs to guests as a form of creating alliances. The cylinder jar form disappears at about 900, 950 when divinely sanctioned kinship disappears in the southern Maya lowlands. And this is about the same time that we first see the cylinder jars in Chaco. So it may be the cylinder jars in Chaco are emulating Mesoamerican forms, or it's independent invention. We do know that the designs and the materials are local. So here you see a cylinder jar, a pitcher, and an enormous bowl, all from Chaco, all made with the same materials and related designs, indicating that if the cylinder jar form is an emulation of the Maya form, they are doing it in the using local materials and local designs. So if it's referencing those Maya cylinder jars, then it's also made to look distinctively different from them by the addition of the lug handles that you can see and by the use of local designs. Why a martini glass? Well, here is where I say that distinctive vessel forms often function to signal information to people non-verbally. And so having a cylinder jar, being able to hold it up, having it associated with cacao, people would see it, they would know what should be inside it, whether it was actually there or not, what it's associated with, what it means. So it's the vessel itself becomes a reporter. It is giving information. It is, to some extent then, like the martini glass. That is, the martini glass is a distinctive vessel form associated with the martini, and when you see people across the room drinking out of a martini glass, you know what is in that glass, right? You see it and you think, oh, they're drinking a martini. Well, the cylinder jar, I believe, had that same kind of function. The vessel itself comes to represent that exotic item that is inside, and it references both Mesoamerica and the South. Now, this kind of argument fits with what we know about other Mesoamerican items in Chaco, including the scarlet macaw that you see here. These are very large parrots that come from the same tropics in Mesoamerica that chocolate comes from. And they occur in Chaco. There are about 32 known from Pueblo Bonito. There also are what is called Pseudo-cloisonné, which is a Mesoamerican, well, I think this one's made out of stone. They're either stone or ceramic, but it's a craft from Mesoamerica that occurs in Chaco, and there are copper bells that come from Mesoamerica. So it's possible that all these items come together as a kind of package coming up from Mesoamerica into Chaco Canyon together, poor macaw wheeling his little bike trying to get there. But in all cases, these items that come from Mesoamerica have very symbolic and economic importance in Mesoamerica as well as in Chaco. So let's look a little bit more closely at what's going on in Chaco, because we can get additional information about drinking activity by looking where the jars come from within Chaco. Now, right now there are 197 known cylinder jars in the US Southwest, and all but 21 of those come from Pueblo Bonito, as you see here. And the turquoise rooms, the ones I've colored in, are the ones where they come from. And you can see that they're sort of vaguely in the four directions. They're not all clustered in one place. Only one was definitely found with a burial in Chaco Canyon. And 112 came from a single room, room 28, which I have marked there. This suggests that they were not owned by individuals, but by a group. I'm going to go back over that again. They don't occur in burials, so they're not buried with individuals. Instead, they're found in groups of vessels within rooms, and in this case, 112 in a single room. And that suggests that they're not owned by individuals, but they are owned by a group, either a kin group or a religious group of some kind. Notice in this slide that room 28, which is this turquoise one right here, is right next to what's called the West Court, which is this courtyard here. And I'll be coming back to that in just a minute. Okay, so room 28 was excavated for the first time in 1896 by Richard Weatherhill and George Pepper. When they got to the bottom, they found this pile of vessels, some of which you see here, mostly cylinder jars. This was the first time anybody had encountered a cylinder jar, and they encountered 112 of them in this one room. Okay, so with funding, they found the jars. I've studied the jars, but they left a lot of questions. They did not take any datable material from the room. They did not record the stratigraphy or the layers of the rooms. They didn't tell us were there features in the rooms like hearths or benches that would help us understand what was going on. So with funding from the National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Geographic Society, the University of New Mexico reopened room 28 in 2013 with a permit from the National Park Service, and the point was to find out why and when the room burned and where the jars had originally been placed. We found that the room itself was originally a domestic space built about AD 900, then it was remodeled in about 1050, and a room-wide shelf made of Douglas fir, which is a tree that they would have to get from the mountains outside Chaco, was built on the western side of the room, the western side being up in this photograph, and the jars were stored on that shelving. The room itself over time had gotten buried up to the plaza level, and it had a stairway, which you can see here, that led up to the plaza, and then an upper room was built, and that upper room had twin T-shaped doorways, so doorways built to shape like a T, side by side in the south wall that led to the court. Here, they were filled in later, so it's kind of hard to see them, but they're definitely there. Okay, so stairway up from the room where the cylinder jars were stored, and then these twin doorways that people could process out into the courtyard, presumably carrying the cylinder jars that were stored down below in two lines, maybe each with 2 cylinder jars. Then in 1100, 173 cylinder jars, bowls, and pitchers were placed in room 28. Many of the vessels were mutilated before they were put in the room. They have cut marks, as you see here. Patches were ground from the surface. The vessels then they were sprinkled with turquoise and shell beads and jet ornaments and shell ornaments. This is just one layer of room 28 at the floor level to give you an idea of how many ornaments we found in the 2013 excavations. And this is a large bowl from room 28 that the ornaments that you can see in the little cutout were found inside it, and we did this reconstruction at the American Museum because we're scientists. It was fun reconstructing what had happened, but the ornaments were actually found in that bowl, and we just put them back in the bowl. Doors were sealed, so there was a doorway located right here, and it was filled with masonry to shut it off. Another door had a stone slab put over it, and the third doorway had a whole pile of vessels put in front of it that essentially blocked it off. A fire was then started underneath the shelving that held most of the cylinder jars, and you can see a deep red area right here. This is the post hole where the fire was set around. The shelves would have been up here. And then the people left. The room burned, shelf collapsed, upper stories collapsed inward, and all of those vessels were buried. If we have time, do we have time? Do we have time? I wanted to just show you a little clip. This is not too long, that shows you room 28. This is LiDAR that was done after we had excavated. You could see we had to have a lot of scaffolding put up so we didn't die with the room falling on us. So this was done by a company called LiDAR Guys. There's the closed door to room 32, closed door to room 51, our escape in case we needed it. And now we've got historic photographs that they put in the right locations to show you exactly what the room was like. So that's one photo. That's the other doorway with the vessels in front of it. That's the cylinder jars as they were found. And that's room 28. Okay. Just as an aside, oops, unless I move, it'll just keep repeating. Just as an aside, in the backfill of room 28, when we reopened it in 2013, we found the missing pieces to that double cylinder jar that I showed you in an earlier slide. They were in the backfill, and what that told us was the double cylinder jar was found in a room that was 2 rooms north of room 28, and it was found by a guy who was a glorified pot hunter. Anyway, he threw his backfill into room 28, and we found a lot of things that he left behind, including fragments of 12 cylinder jars that nobody knew existed, but happened to be in the backfill of room 28. Okay, so that was an aside. Okay, so why terminate the jars? What happened that you would have this elaborate ritualized termination, and it's not a destructive termination in the sense that they weren't treating the vessels badly. Instead, the vessels were brought together, they were honored with all of this turquoise and shell and jet and ornaments, and then buried. And it is what anthropologists call a reverential termination. That is, the vessels were being retired, but they were being retired with honor. So they were vessels that were seen as having power in use. They were probably animated, seen as having souls. And when they were no longer going to be used, that power had to be removed and the vessels put in a place where they were not using that power in some way. So the situation at room 28 tells us that these drinking vessels were seen as having a lot of power, but that power needed to be ended. It's possible that the group that owned the jars and ritual associated with them had left Pueblo Bonito, or the last practitioner had died off, or the ritual was replaced, or it was some kind of cyclical destruction. I don't know the answer to that. But one interesting thing is that when that closed doorway that had the masonry in it was opened, on the other side of the door was a room that had 5 mugs in it, and this is the open doorway, and you can just see one of the mugs right inside the doorway. Well, why is that important? Because the mug replaced the cylinder jar. Mugs, like pitchers, occur in burials and are individual drinking vessels. So does this shift to mugs indicate new alliances, particularly with groups to the north who drank from mugs? We know that the people who lived in the Mesa Verde area had been using mugs for quite a while. Does this suggest that people from that area had moved into Chaco? Does it suggest that there was a new alliance with them, or they had introduced new practices that did not involve the cylinder jar? We don't know. It's possible a new faction, the mug faction, the muggers as we call them. Those muggers took over and got rid of the cylinder jar people. Okay. It's interesting, though, that both the mug and the pitcher are really distinctively northern forms, whereas the cylinder jar really has ties to the south. And that was eliminated. So I promise I'm almost at the end, just 3 more slides. Okay, so if we look at the Chaco and drinking vessels over time, what we see is that the cylinder jars in particular were, they were both made in Chaco and outside of Chaco, but when they're made outside of Chaco, they were brought to Chaco. So unlike the Maya situation where the Maya lord is handing out cylinder jars to visitors who take them home, in this case, cylinder jars are being brought to Pueblo Bonito and staying there. So we have foreign vessels in Chaco, but they don't leave. They're used with an exotic drink, probably in ceremonies in a courtyard, possibly with 2 lines of procession from those twin T-shaped doorways. Paired jars were used to make chocolate. It was owned by a group, not by individuals. It was not associated with kiva activities at all. They never occur in kivas. The jars seem to have been viewed as animate, having souls, and the power that they had needed to be removed when they were no longer in use. It's possible that one group had differentiated themselves by adopting cacao in cylinder jars, symbolically tying themselves to Mesoamerican groups that use cylinder jars. It may have been a sort of a consciously hybrid form with the Mesoamerican shape with the local designs. It probably was associated with some kind of competing claims to authority, because where there is no competition or factionalism, you usually don't get these kinds of displays. So you get these competitive events when people are trying to attract followers. And if you don't need to attract followers, you don't get the events, and only a few people get to drink these special substances. Part of my project, I've really focused on room 28 because we did the excavations there, but part of my project will be looking at the cylinder jars that come from other rooms in Chaco and outside of Chaco and seeing where they occur and how they were treated. Another part is that I'm very interested in a recent revival of cylinder jars. Since this research was completed in the chocolate research was completed in 2019. Many Pueblo potters have begun making cylinder jars. In the Hotel Chaco in Albuquerque, in the lobby, there's a set of just beautiful cylinder jars that were made into lamps that you can see if you go in there. And then there are a number of potters, some of them in this room, who make cylinder jars. And yes, I know that one of these is a pitcher. But she didn't, I couldn't find a picture of one of her cylinder jars. We'll work on that. And Tim sent me a picture too late on Facebook, so we'll work on that as well. And so I'm very interested in the revival and want to talk to some of the Pueblo potters who are working on this, because I think their work is so interesting. Thank you. Sure, yeah, if it's okay.
So we'll take a few questions, but please keep in mind that Professor Crown hasn't had lunch yet, and we're moving on to a discussion. So we'll take 3 or 4 questions and then call it a day.